Why we believe in the Holy Spirit. Now, sometimes people think that the Holy Spirit is actually a doctrine that came into existence with Christians. However, let's look at the Bible and let's see what it actually says. In Genesis chapter 1, we actually find out that the Holy Spirit was in the very beginning. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It reads, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Now, sometimes we miss the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament because we see phrases like Spirit of God, Spirit of the Lord, different things like that. He's oftentimes not called the Holy Spirit. In the New Testament, he usually is called the Holy Spirit. Either way, we see this is the same Spirit, this Holy Spirit of God. He was with God in the very beginning. So, from the very first page of the Bible, we see the Holy Spirit has always been there. However, in the New Testament, he serves a very interesting role. In John's Gospel, in John chapter 14, we find out that the Holy Spirit is actually promised to the church. John 14, verses 16 through 18. This is Jesus speaking, and he says, "And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you, and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him. But you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you." So here what Jesus is telling his disciples is he's promising that they're going to receive another advocate. Yeah, he's with them, and yes, he's helping them at this time, but they're going to receive somebody else who's going to help. That is the Spirit of truth, like what's stated in verse 17. We also see that at the end of verse 17, that this Holy Spirit is going to live with the disciples, but is also going to be in the disciples. It's an interesting relationship that the Holy Spirit has with the church, because the Holy Spirit is with the church, but also lives within the church. So let's look at the fulfillment of this prophecy. In Acts chapter 1, we find out in verses 4 and 5 that prophecy is stated again. "On one occasion, while Jesus was eating with them, he gave them this command: 'Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit.'" So this is something that even from early on, even before Jesus Christ himself started his own earthly ministry, we find that John the Baptist, he's baptizing people in water. But then from the very beginning of all of that, they were promised that there's going to be someone coming later. There's going to be a different type of baptism. There's going to be something about the Holy Spirit, some involvement of the Holy Spirit that was not involved with the baptism of John's baptism. And this we see happening in the church throughout the book of Acts, but even from the very first chapter of Acts. But let's keep reading because there's even more about the Holy Spirit in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 2, verse 4, we see whenever this completely is fulfilled. And it says, "All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them." This is very interesting because on the day of Pentecost, just a few days after Jesus himself after he's raised from the dead, he ascended into heaven. Well, this happens on the day of Pentecost. So they were filled with the Holy Spirit. However, not everybody was just completely understanding in what was happening. Some people wanted to know what was going on. That's why if you keep reading, you find out this. In Acts chapter 2, verse 14, we read, "Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and addressed the crowd. 'Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say.'" And he goes on and he explains that. Verse 14 starts off that explanation, and it goes on throughout pretty much the rest of this chapter. However, when we look in verse 16, this is the first thing that he says, and he's talking about the Holy Spirit and explaining the experience that they were having right there. He says in verse 16, "No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people." And if you keep reading throughout the rest of this chapter in Acts and throughout the rest of the book of Acts, you will find out that the Holy Spirit is completely involved in what the church is doing, and the Holy Spirit does great things through the church within the church. And that is why we believe in the Holy Spirit today.